everyone, this is Pico Entertainment and we're back again, and here now we have another video for you. And following the recent news or speculation that actor Nicholas Hoult will be the next big screen Lex Luthor in the upcoming Superman Legacy by James Gunn, I thought it'd be good to look over the previous and current live action interpretations of the character and decide which version, worst to best, was the greatest portrayal of what is considered to be the most iconic Superman villain. So if we start off then in terms of this debate going on what I believe is the worst interpretation, and I think most people would also agree that, would have to go to Jesse Eisenberg from Batman vs Superman in 2016. Much less a corporate businessman and much more of a hipster in terms of his appearance, with his long hair, his very nerdy, jittery mannerisms and movements. He just lacks any intensity or imposing presence in terms of his stature, things that I think are quite necessary for Lex Luthor, and Eisenberg is just nowhere near it. Now, to be fair, I think it's much more about how the character was written rather than Jesse's own performance, and of course he had to adjust his acting to how this character was set up. But I just think overall it was a disastrous miscasting, with Jesse himself as an actor just being too young, too small in size to really convince us as Lex Luthor, and you really just can't take him seriously throughout the entire movie. It doesn't even matter when we see him at the end of the film with his shaven head, he still doesn't really provide that real weight or gravitas that we'd expect to see from the character himself. So overall, just a bad choice, and overall a bad performance and a bad interpretation from Jesse Eisenberg in the role. We then go on to the next choice, and it's Kevin Spacey from Superman Returns in 2006. Although a great actor and accomplished one that he is, his Lex Luthor is very much more of a hammy, more jokey version, repeating the same land estate ambitions that we saw from the Richard Donner movies. Again, not really carrying any real presence here. There's nothing really memorable or unique about this particular take. It's not a horrific version, I would say, but it's just very typically much more on the comedic side, and one that I felt was very disappointing when I watched the film, a bit underwhelming, very much like the movie itself. The next version we have on here is Jon Cryer from the Supergirl series. Having played Lex's nephew Lenny in Superman 4: The Quest for Peace, the actor took on Lex Luthor, and he didn't appear in the series until the 4th season halfway through. And a lot of people, including myself, were very skeptical when he was cast in the role, but his version I think worked quite well in the 4th season. He was much more of a snarky personality, conveying the hatred and jealousy of Superman that is very much a facet of the character. And certainly in the 4th season, he walks that line just about right in terms of the more serious aspect, with the more exaggerated, the much more eccentric flavour that I think, if played right, can suit the character well as well. And I think the seriousness was retained mostly in season 4. And in terms of the story, we see him coming out of incarceration after many years, slowly working his way in the background behind his sister Lena, who owns the Luthor Corp business. He had that certain underhandedness and manipulative nature that we would certainly expect from a Lex Luthor character, and he did become much more dominant in season 5, and this was probably at the expense of Lena, but shortly afterwards the direction did go a lot more campy, and he became far less interesting as the series progressed. But I think as efforts go, his take was a lot better than I think anybody had any right to expect. Now the next version on the list is probably still the most well-known version of the character, certainly amongst more general audiences, and that is of course Gene Hackman's version from the Christopher Reeve Superman movies. Now in this case, this Lex Luthor was far less of the affluent businessman and much more of the underground criminal. We see him hiding away in subways. He had far less impact and far less. We only really see the likes of Tessmus Harker and also Otis helping him. And this interpretation was carried much more by the natural screen charisma of Gene Hackman. This is a character that's much more of a schemer than a dominant personality. And it's played a lot more for laughs, particularly in Superman 2, where we see him really mocking the likes of General Zod and the other Kryptonians. But with his outlandish land estate plans, or whether he wanted to claim rule over Australia, it's not really a Lex Luthor that you take too seriously. There's not really a lot of that threat level. This is a Lex Luthor that Superman really shouldn't have any trouble at all apprehending. So as much as I love the Christopher Reeve movies, or indeed Gene Hackman as an actor, I don't think this version of Lex Luthor is one that I would put in that upper echelon of truly great interpretations of the character. We then go on to a much more interesting take, and that's from Michael Chiklis from the Superman and Lois series. Coming in late in the show's 3rd season, His Lex was wrongfully imprisoned for many years following evidence collected by Lois, and he ultimately wants revenge against both her and Superman. This was much more of a grounded, less flamboyant version, really in keeping with the same tones that what we saw with the series itself. This is probably the most physically imposing of live-action Lex Luthors, as we see him becoming a hardened bruiser within the prison, adjusting to life before walking away free, where we see him on a very long walk all the way to Lois's house, as we get flashbacks to how he became much more toughened when he was in his jail cells. This is much more of a serious, more threatening personality, which is good, I think. And I think you do need that certain element in terms of Lex Luthor. Again, we're dealing with a character that has no superpowers whatsoever. So he does have to have that certain edge to him if we are to believe that he could truly mess around with Superman. Now, whilst he was much more threatening, he was perhaps a bit less charismatic than other versions, and maybe perhaps a bit more one note. But to be fair, he's only in the show for a couple of episodes. But I think overall, this is a Lex Luthor that has a certain conviction. And when he says he's going to do something, you truly believe it. So overall, I think a very decent to good take for the character in the short term from Superman and Lois. We then come on to what's probably the runner-up on this list, and that is John Shea from Lois and Clark, The Adventures of Superman. Primarily appearing in the first season of the series, whilst he didn't look much like Lex Luthor, he was 100% much more of the Titan businessman that we associate very much with the character. We see him in all of the suave suits, he has that natural media celebrity persona, definitely coming across with all of the confidence and swagger and intelligence of boys, and this is why I think his characterization fits so well. Now yes, he does eventually get the bold look later on within the series, but I think overall they were much more outlandish storylines. They didn't really have the consistency than what we saw within the first season of the show. And whilst he was clearly the villain, of course, there was much more of a likability and a charm, which again I think Lex Luthor should have to an extent, because we have to believe that this is a personality who was fully aware of how he's perceived within the media, and we normally expect Lex to use that media perception to try and turn the public against Superman. This is a character that we do believe can be a couple of steps ahead of Superman and certainly outwit him in terms of tactics and strategy. Now, whilst I think this version, if he were to appear now, would probably have to be refined a little bit. Again, we go back to the later appearances throughout the series, but overall I still think it's a very good interpretation of the character. We then move on to the number one position, the best live action interpretation of Lex Luthor, by some clear distance in my opinion and for many fans, and that is of course Michael Rosenbaum from the Great Smallville series. For 7 seasons of the show, his version was very much more of an origin of the character, very much a story of what would come to be in the future, as what we saw with Clark Kent in the role played by Tom Welling. And this approach found extra depth and complexity to the character that we hadn't seen or expected before. This was a person who was much more traumatized in terms of his childhood, having to grow up alone, forever burdened by the notoriety of the Luthor name. A character who was much more good-natured, but we would steadily see him brought over to the dark side as the series continued. This was a character very much conflicted by wanting to become a better person, but at the same time always being attracted to the greater path of destiny and influence that was brought on by him being associated with the Luthor family. It was quite the character arc, so strong and refreshing. The two most fascinating aspects of this interpretation was having Lex be friends with Clark in their younger years, a concept that was quite questionable at the time given their future destinies, but it was a dynamic that worked brilliantly, and their overall juxtaposition added so much to the overall story. Now, the real special ingredient of this interpretation was Lex's relationship with his father Lionel Luthor, played just as well by Julian Glover, and a constant back and forth between them, whether it was a battle of wits, affection or approval or ego or tactics. The constant changes in this dynamic was without question one of the best elements in the entire series, and this relationship really added weight to the character, making him much more sympathetic. Again, where we learn much more of his backstory, particularly in the 3rd season, where we see what happens to his younger brother Julian, and also earlier where we see him experiencing mental illness. And the constant one-upmanship between him and Lionel was very much more of a chess game. Again, you can look at these elements and really see how Lex Luthor could grow up to be the man that we all know him to be in terms of the classical villain, later on in terms of this version here. Michael Rosenbaum played him brilliantly, giving him that sense of intelligence and authority, but at the same time there was also vulnerability here. There were certain times when many people saw Lex as perhaps the second protagonist of the series. There would be times where we would actually side with Lex much more than we would with Clark in terms of any intense debate or argument. And you can easily see how this character would go on to become the true iconic Lex Luthor in the future. And alongside that is why I believe that Michael Rosenbaum from Smallville still ranks today as the best ever live action interpretation of Lex Luthor. So there's my overall thoughts and feelings when looking back at the previous and current live action versions of Lex Luthor. Let me know what you think in the comments below. How do you think Nicholas Hoult will stand up in comparison to these previous versions that I've mentioned in this breakdown? And if you disagree with any of the choices that I've made or the order that I've selected them in, then also let me know within the comments. We can have further debate. And if you have any other further suggestions regarding any other topics, movies, television series, or any other issues within the pop entertainment and culture scene that you'd also like to see me cover, then also let me know within the comments, and I will see if I can provide further commentary for you on that subject matter within the future. Please consider hitting like the subscription and notification buttons so I can provide you with more high quality content like this in the future. But that's it for now. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you very, very soon.